Sometimes fate doesn't knock on your door. Sometimes it collapses on your doorstep, half frozen
Stay
and
with
barely
me. Can you hear
breathing
me?
in the middle of the worst
I know.
blizzard
Hold on. I'll
Montana's
get you
seen
warm.
in 20
trying.
years.
Hold on.
Thaddeus Crowe
Tell me where
had
it
been
is.
alone in these
I
mountains
don't know.
for 7
Please
winters,
don't.
and
You
he'd
leave me no
convinced himself
choice.
he preferred it that way. No one to disappoint, no one to lose, no one to wake up beside only to find them cold and still when the fever broke in the night. The cabin he'd built with his own hands stood at 7,200 feet where the Bitterroot Range scraped the belly of the sky. 3 days' hard ride from Bannock, the nearest town worth the name. 6 weeks from anything resembling civilization. It was exactly as far from the world as a man could get without falling off the edge entirely. On the morning everything changed, Thade was checking his trap lines before the storm hit. He'd felt it coming in his bones, the particular ache in his left shoulder where a bullet had shattered the joint during his marshalling days, the way the air went still and heavy like the mountain itself was holding its breath. The sky had turned the color of old iron, pregnant with snow that would fall hard and mean. He'd made his preparations the night before, firewood stacked to the rafters, venison smoking in the shed lamp oil counted and rationed. A man survived winters this high by respecting what could kill him. He was kneeling beside his 8th trap. Empty again, the rabbit smart enough to hole up before the weather turned when he saw the dark shape against the white. At first he thought it might be a deer driven down from the higher elevations by the approaching storm. But as he moved closer, his heart hammering against his ribs, he saw the truth that would unravel everything he thought he knew about his carefully constructed solitude. It was a woman. She lay crumpled in the snow like a broken doll, dressed in clothing so utterly wrong for this country it would have been comical if it weren't so deadly. A traveling dress of deep blue wool, now soaked through and already freezing stiff. Leather boots with decorative buttons, the kind made for cobblestone streets, not mountain trails. No coat thick enough to matter. No gloves. No hat. Thade dropped to his knees beside her, yanking off his glove to press 2 fingers against her throat. Her skin was cold as creek stones, the color of old snow. For one terrible moment he thought he was too late. Then he felt it, a pulse so faint and slow he might have imagined it, but there, still there. "Damn fool woman," he muttered, already shrugging out of his heavy coat. "What the hell are you doing up here?" She didn't answer, couldn't answer. Her lips had gone blue, and ice crystals clung to her dark hair like a crown of diamonds that would kill her if he didn't move fast. Thade knew hypothermia. Had seen men die from it during the war, watched them slip away with confused smiles on their faces as their bodies shut down. He knew she had maybe an hour before her core temperature dropped too low for any recovery. Maybe less. He wrapped her in his coat, then lifted her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, and the lightness of her terrified him more than anything else. How long had she been out here? How far had she walked before she fell? The wind picked up as he started back toward the cabin, carrying the first fat flakes of snow. Within minutes it was coming down so thick he could barely see 10 feet ahead. He knew these woods like some men knew. Scripture could have walked them blind, and he was grateful for that knowledge now as he pushed through drifts that climbed past his knees. By the time he kicked open the cabin door, his arms were screaming and his breath came in ragged gasps. The woman in his arms hadn't moved, hadn't made a sound. Her head lolled against his shoulder, and he could see frost forming on her eyelashes. "Don't you die on me," he said, surprised by the fierceness in his own voice. "Not in my damn house." The cabin was cold. He'd let the fire burn low before heading out, but it was shelter, and shelter was the first battle. He laid her on his bed, the only real bed in the single room, and immediately started stripping away her wet clothes. There was no room for modesty when death was winning. He'd seen too many bodies in his time as a marshal to be squeamish about bare skin. Her traveling dress came off in sections, buttons scattering, as his cold, numbed fingers fumbled with the fastenings. Underneath, she wore layer upon layer of Eastern finery, a corset petticoat chemise, all soaked through. He cut through the corset strings with his hunting knife, cursing whoever had convinced women they needed to bind their ribs like that. When she was down to skin, he could see the full extent of what she'd endured. Bruises mottled her arms, some fresh, some fading to yellow-green. His jaw tightened as he recognized the distinctive marks finger-shaped on her upper arms, the kind left when someone grabbed hard enough to hurt. But there was no time to wonder about that now. He wrapped her in every blanket he owned, then built up the fire until the cabin felt like the inside of an oven. Too much heat too fast could be as dangerous as the cold, but he needed to warm the air around her, needed to stop the relentless theft of her body heat. Her feet worried him most. When he'd pulled off those useless boots, her toes had been white as candle wax, no pink in them at all. He filled a basin with water, not hot, lukewarm, carefully tested, and submerged her feet, watching for any sign of response. Nothing. Thade had delivered coffee to dying men who'd shown more signs of life. He heated broth on the stove, the same venison broth he'd been living on for the past week, and tried to get some between her lips. Most of it dribbled down her chin, but he thought maybe she swallowed once, twice. It would have to be enough. The storm raged outside, wind screaming like something alive and angry. Snow piled against the windows, blocking out what little light remained of the afternoon. Thade lit the lamps and settled into the chair beside the bed, watching the rise and fall of her chest beneath the blankets. She was beautiful, he realized with a strange detachment. Not mountain beautiful, weathered and strong, Eastern beautiful, the kind that belonged in drawing rooms and theater boxes. Dark hair that would probably shine like silk when it wasn't matted with ice and snow. Features that spoke of good breeding and better fortune, or at least fortune that should have kept her far from places like this. "Who are you?" he asked the silent room, "and what in God's name brought you to my mountain?" The only answer was the wind and the crackle of the fire. He checked her pulse every hour, monitoring the slow climb back from the edge. Sometime around midnight, he felt it strengthen, felt her body begin the long fight back toward life. Her skin gradually lost that corpse-gray pallor, warming to something closer to natural color. But she didn't wake. The storm lasted 3 days, the kind of blizzard that rewrote the landscape and reminded men how small they were. Thade left her side only to tend the fire, to heat more broth, to check that the cabin wasn't getting buried entirely. Snow climbed halfway up the walls. The world outside became a white void, nothing visible beyond the frost-covered windows but the endless fall of snow. During those 3 days, the woman on his bed burned with fever. She thrashed against the blankets, muttering words he couldn't quite catch. Names, maybe, please. Once she cried out, "Please don't," with such anguish that his chest tightened, and he found himself taking her hand, murmuring reassurances to someone who couldn't hear him. "You're safe," he told her, and wondered if he was lying. "Whatever you're running from, it can't reach you here." On the 3rd night, her fever broke. He woke, slumped in his chair, to find her watching him with eyes the color of deep water, clear and aware, and absolutely terrified. They stared at each other for a long moment, her gaze darting around the cabin, taking in the rough log walls, the bearskin rug, the rifles mounted above the door, before returning to his face with an expression that hit him like a fist to the gut. She was afraid of him. "Easy," he said, holding up his hands, showing her empty palms. "You're safe. I'm not going to hurt you." Her hand moved beneath the blankets, quick and furtive, searching for something. A weapon, he realized. She'd been carrying a weapon and now couldn't find it. Looking for this... He reached slowly into his vest pocket and pulled out the small derringer he'd found tucked in the waistband of her petticoats. 2-shot .41 caliber, the kind of gun a lady might carry for protection. Well-maintained, recently oiled. This was not a woman unfamiliar with the idea of defending herself. He set it on the table beside the bed, well within her reach. "Loaded," he said. "Though I'd appreciate it if you didn't shoot me, seeing as I just spent 3 days keeping you from dying." She stared at the gun, then at him, confusion joining the fear in her expression. "You're giving it back." Her voice was hoarse from disuse, but cultured, educated. Eastern cities written in every carefully pronounced syllable. "It's yours," he said simply. "Figure you had your reasons for carrying it, same reasons maybe that put those bruises on your arms." She flinched, pulling the blankets tighter around herself, and he saw the moment she realized she was naked beneath them. "Did you—" She couldn't finish the question, but he heard it anyway, and it carved something hollow in his chest. "Only what was necessary to save your life, ma'am," he said, his voice harder than he meant it to be. "Your clothes were soaked through freezing to your skin. I had to get them off before you died of exposure, that's all. You have my word as—" He paused, then finished quietly, "as a former United States Marshal." Something in his tone must have convinced her, because the stark terror in her eyes eased slightly, though wariness remained. "How long?" she asked. 3 days since I found you. 4 since you collapsed in my trap line, near as I can figure." He stood, moving to the stove to give her space. "Storms passed, but there's 4 feet of snow out there, and more coming. You picked a hell of a time to go wandering in the Montana high country." "I wasn't wandering." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I was running." Thade poured coffee, the chicory-laced brew he'd been living on, and brought her a cup. She took it with shaking hands, and he saw that her fingers were bandaged. He'd wrapped them when he feared frostbite might claim them. "Running from what?" he asked, settling back into his chair. "Or should I ask from who?" She sipped the coffee, made a face at the bitterness, but drank anyway. When she spoke, she chose her words with the care of someone who'd learned that truth could be dangerous. "A marriage I didn't want. An arrangement made by men who thought they had the right to decide my future." She met his eyes, and he saw steel beneath the fear. "I refused. He didn't accept my refusal." Thade's hands clenched on his own cup hard enough that the tin bent slightly. The bruises on her arms suddenly made perfect sense, as did the little gun and the desperate flight into country that could kill her as surely as any angry man. "He hurt you," he said, not quite a question. "He tried to." Her voice steadied, finding strength in the telling. "But I got away before he could finish what he started." "Got a name, this man?" She hesitated, and he saw her weighing what to tell him, how much trust to extend to a stranger who'd seen her naked and helpless. "Does it matter?" she asked finally. "He's back east, Philadelphia. Might as well be another world from here." "Philadelphia's a long way to run," Thade observed. "And a long way for a man to chase if he's of a mind to." Her laugh was bitter, brittle. "Oh, he'll chase. Men like Augustus Thornhill don't accept defeat gracefully. But I had 3 weeks' head start, and enough money to cover my tracks. He'll be looking for a woman traveling alone, probably checking hotels and boarding houses. He won't think to look for someone frozen to death in the Montana wilderness." "Augustus Thornhill." Thade rolled the name around, testing it. "Name's familiar. Railroad family." She nodded, surprised. "His father owns the Northeastern Pacific, or half of it anyway. They're influential, powerful. The kind of men who are used to getting exactly what they want." "And young Mr. Thornhill wanted you." "Wanted to own me," she corrected, her voice hard. "There's a difference. I was a suitable acquisition. My father held shares in the Pennsylvania line, and my dowry would have sealed a merger. It was a business transaction dressed up as a romance, and I was too naive to see it until it was almost too late." She looked down at her bandaged hands, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer, vulnerable, in a way that made Thade's chest ache. "I left everything, my family, my home, whatever future I might have had, because the alternative was worse. Is that cowardice or courage? I genuinely don't know anymore." "It's survival," Thade said quietly, "and there's no shame in surviving." They sat in silence for a moment, the only sounds the crack and pop of the fire and the endless whisper of wind against the walls. "I should probably tell you my name," she said finally. "Since you've seen me at my absolute worst and somehow kept me alive through it. I'm Serafina Marlowe. Sarah to people who don't need to be formal." "Thaddeus Crow," he replied. "Thade to the handful of folks who still bother talking to me." Why don't they bother Mr. Crow? Because I live 7,200 feet up a mountain in a cabin I built with my own hands, 3 days' ride from the nearest town, and I haven't given anyone cause to visit in 7 years. He met her eyes. I like it that way, or I did anyway. Sarah studied him with an intensity that made him want to look away. He was suddenly conscious of how he must appear, beard-grown, long and unkempt clothes that had seen better years, the hard lines that 7 years of solitude had carved into his face. He was 48 years old, but looked older, weathered by altitude and isolation and a grief that never quite faded. "Why 7 years?" she asked. "What happened 7 years ago?" The question hung between them, and Thade felt the old wound tear open fresh. But there was something about this woman, this stranger who'd nearly died on his doorstep, that made him want to answer honestly. "I failed to protect the people who mattered most," he said, "and I've been paying for that failure ever since." He stood abruptly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "You should eat something more than broth. Can you sit up?" She pushed herself upright, keeping the blankets clutched around her shoulders, and he saw her wince as blood flow returned to extremities that had been too cold for too long. "Everything hurts," she admitted. "That's good. Means you're alive. Dead doesn't hurt." He brought her bread and salt pork, watched her eat with the careful attention of someone who'd nursed wounded men before. She had an appetite, which was a good sign. The fever had broken clean, and her color was improving. She'd lost toes before, seen it happen more times than he cared to count, but her feet looked like they'd escaped permanent damage. Lucky. Incredibly, impossibly lucky. "The storm's passed," he said as she ate, "but we've got 4 feet of snow on the ground and more in the forecast. The pass down to the valley won't be clear until spring melt, March at the earliest, more likely April." Sarah's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "March, that's 5 months away." "5 months minimum," he confirmed. "Could be 6 if we get a hard winter, which we usually do. I won't lie to you, Miss Marlowe. You're stuck here, with me, in a one-room cabin that barely has space for 1 person, let alone 2. He watched her process this, saw the moment the full reality of her situation settled over her shoulders like a weight. "I don't have anywhere else to go," she said finally, her voice small. "Even if I could leave tomorrow, where would I go? Augustus will have hired people to look for me. Private detectives, probably. He has the resources to search every town between here and San Francisco, and if he finds me—" She didn't finish, but she didn't need to. Thade had seen enough of the world to know what happened to women who defied powerful men. "Then you stay," he said simply, "at least until the pass is clear. After that, you can decide where you want to go and how you want to get there. I won't hold you here." "Why would you help me?" The question came out sharp, suspicious. "You don't know me. I could be a criminal, a liar, trouble you don't need." "Could be all those things," Thade agreed. "Probably are if you're running from Philadelphia money. But I figure anyone desperate enough to climb into the Montana wilderness in October dressed like you're heading to a church social has earned a chance to survive the consequences." He gestured toward the window where snow still fell in lazy, heavy flakes. "Besides, I'm not what you'd call a pillar of the community. Got no reputation to protect, no neighbors close enough to gossip. You want to wait out the winter here, you're welcome to it. But understand the terms. I'm not a hotel and I'm not running a charity. You'll work for your keep. I'll teach you what you need to survive up here, but you have to be willing to learn. Can you accept that—" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her gaze moving around the cabin, taking inventory of her prison or perhaps her sanctuary. When she looked back at him, something had changed in her expression. The fear had receded, replaced by a kind of desperate determination. "I can learn," she said. "I'm stronger than I look, Mr. Crow. I have to be." "Then we'll manage," Thade said. "Though you should know I'm not an easy teacher, and this isn't an easy life. You'll earn every meal, every warm blanket, every day you survive. Out here, useless means dead. I won't let you be useless. I understand. Do you—" He leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. Because I've seen city folk come west thinking it's some kind of adventure, thinking survival is romantic. It's not. It's brutal and unforgiving, and it'll kill you the moment you forget to respect it. You're going to bleed. You're going to cry. You're going to wonder if running was worth it, if maybe dying back east wouldn't have been easier. But if you stick it out, if you learn what I teach you, you'll walk out of here in the spring stronger than you ever imagined you could be. Sarah held his gaze, and he saw the moment she made her choice. Saw her square her shoulders and lift her chin, saw that steel beneath the eastern refinement rise to the surface. "Then teach me," she said. "Teach me how to survive." Thade nodded slowly, something like respect warming in his chest. "Get some rest," he said. "Tomorrow your real education begins." That night Thade gave her the bed and made himself a pallet on the floor near the stove. It wasn't comfortable, but he'd slept in worse places. Through the small hours, he lay awake, listening to her breathe steady and strong, now the sound of life continuing against all odds. He thought about Lydia, who'd been dead 7 years this winter. Thought about Owen and baby Nathaniel buried on the hillside behind the cabin where wildflowers would grow come spring. He'd built this isolation to protect himself from ever feeling that kind of loss again. And now here was this woman, this stranger, disrupting his carefully maintained solitude without even trying. "Damn fool thing to do," he muttered to the darkness. "Taking in strays." But even as he said it, he knew he'd do it again. Knew that some part of him that had been frozen as solid as the ground outside was beginning against his better judgment to thaw. Outside the mountains settled into winter's grip, and inside 2 damaged souls began the long, careful work of learning to trust again. The first full day of Sarah's education began before dawn when Thade shook her awake with a gentle but insistent hand on her shoulder. "Up," he said. "Day's wasting." Sarah groaned, every muscle in her body screaming protest. The near-death experience had taken its toll, and she felt like she'd been beaten with clubs. "It's still dark," she mumbled. "It's winter in the mountains. It's dark until 8 and dark again by 4. You want to sleep away half your daylight, that's your choice, but you won't eat if you don't work." The casual bluntness of it shocked her, fully awake. She sat up, clutching the blankets, and found him already dressed, building up the fire. "I have clothes for you," he said, not looking at her. "Nothing fancy, but they'll keep you warm and let you move. Woman from the trading post in Bannock left some things here years back. They should fit near enough." He laid out the garments on the table wool trousers, a flannel shirt, thick socks, and a leather vest lined with sheep's wool. They were worn but clean, practical in a way her Philadelphia wardrobe had never been. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Don't thank me yet. Get dressed. We've got work." She dressed while he busied himself at the stove, giving her the illusion of privacy in the cramped space. The clothes fit better than she expected, though the trousers felt scandalous. No woman of her acquaintance had ever worn trousers, but then again, no woman of her acquaintance had ever needed to survive a Montana winter at 7,200 feet. Thade handed her a tin cup of coffee and a plate of something that might generously be called breakfast cold cornbread and strips of dried meat. "You'll learn to cook eventually," he said. "But for now, you eat what I make. Don't waste anything. Food's scarce this high up, especially in winter." The coffee was bitter enough to make her eyes water, and the meat was so tough she had to gnaw at it like a wolf. But it was sustenance, and her body craved it with a hunger that surprised her. "First lesson," Thade said as they ate. "Fire. It's the difference between living and dying up here. You need to know how to build one, maintain one, and read what it's telling you. Come here." He led her to the stone fireplace where coals glowed red beneath half-burned logs. "See how I've arranged these logs, not just thrown in randomly. There's a technique. Airflow matters. Too tight, the fire suffocates. Too loose, it burns too fast and you waste wood. Watch." His hands moved with practiced efficiency, adjusting logs, adding kindling at precise points. It looked simple when he did it, but Sarah knew instinctively that simple didn't mean easy. "Now you try," he said, raking out the existing fire. "Build it from scratch. She knelt before the cold hearth, her bandaged fingers clumsy as she tried to arrange kindling the way he'd shown her. It took her 3 tries to get the structure stable, and when she finally struck the match awkward with the bandages, the kindling smoked but wouldn't catch. "You're smothering it," Thade observed. "Fire needs to breathe, space between the kindling. Try again, again, and again, and again." Her fingers ached. Her back cramped from kneeling. Smoke stung her eyes and made her cough. But on the 7th try, a small flame caught and held, growing stronger as it found purchase in the dry wood. "There," Thade said, and she heard something that might have been approval in his voice. "That'll keep you alive. Now maintain it for the next hour while I check the traps." He bundled into his coat and disappeared into the white world beyond the door, leaving Sarah alone with her small, precious fire. She fed it carefully, terrified of letting it die, adding wood piece by piece as the flames grew stronger. When Thade returned an hour later, stamping snow from his boots, he found her still kneeling by the hearth, her face smudged with ash, but her fire burning steady and true. "Good," he said simply, and the single word filled her with more pride than 1,000 Philadelphia compliments ever had. The days fell into a rhythm brutal but purposeful. Every morning fire, every afternoon some new skill that seemed impossible until suddenly it wasn't. Chopping wood or trying to her initial attempts, sending the axe glancing off to embed itself in the chopping block, while Thade watched with barely concealed amusement. Hauling water from the creek, learning to break through the ice without falling in. Preparing food which turned out to be infinitely more complicated than she'd imagined. "Cooking's chemistry," Thade explained as she burned yet another batch of biscuits. "Wrong proportions, wrong temperature, wrong timing, it all matters. Your Philadelphia servants made it look easy because they'd done it 10,000 times. You're on attempt 12. Give yourself grace, but pay attention to what went wrong." She paid attention. To everything. The way he read the weather by the color of the sky and the behavior of the birds. The way he moved through the forest like a ghost, leaving barely a trace. The way he could field dress a rabbit in under a minute, his knife flashing with precision, born of necessity. "You were a marshal," she said one evening as they sat by the fire, her hands busy mending one of his shirts. She'd learned to sew properly, not decorative embroidery, but functional repairs that actually held. "In your old life." "I was," he confirmed. "Why did you stop?" The question hung in the air between them, and she thought he wouldn't answer. But then his gaze moved to the window, to the darkness beyond, and she knew he was seeing something that wasn't there anymore. "I was tracking a gang of bank robbers through Nebraska territory," he said, his voice distant. "Good men, the other marshals with me. We'd been on their trail for 3 weeks. Got close, too close. They knew we were coming." He paused, his jaw working. "They sent word ahead to the settlement where my family was staying. My wife Lydia, my boys Owen and Nathaniel, 6 and 8 months old. The gang, they wanted to slow us down, give themselves time to run." Sarah's breath caught. She knew suddenly and terribly how this story ended. "I got the telegram in a town called Broken Bow. 2 sentences. Family killed. Come home. I rode for 3 days straight, nearly killed my horse getting there, but I was too late. 3 days too late." "Thade," she whispered, but he shook his head. "I stayed long enough to bury them. Then I resigned my commission, sold everything I owned, and came here. Built this cabin with my own hands, dug those 3 graves on the hillside. And I promised myself I'd never care about anyone enough to feel that kind of loss again." The weight of his grief filled the small cabin like smoke, thick and choking. Sarah set down her mending and moved to sit beside him, not touching, but close enough that he'd know he wasn't alone. "I'm sorry," she said. "Those are empty words, I know, but I don't have better ones." "Nobody does," he said. "That's the hell of it. There are no words for that kind of losing." They sat in silence, 2 people carrying wounds that would never fully heal, and Sarah understood finally why he'd chosen this isolated existence, why he'd given her his bed and his time and his hard-won knowledge without asking anything in return. He was trying to save someone because he couldn't save the ones who'd mattered most. The weeks passed, measured in small victories and hard-learned lessons. Sarah learned to split kindling without embedding the axe in her foot. Learned to shoot Thade's rifle with enough accuracy to hit a target at 50 yards, not great but better than helpless. Learned to read animal tracks in the snow and understand what they meant: food, danger, competition for resources. She learned the mountain's moods the way the wind changed before a storm. The particular quality of light that meant another blizzard was bearing down. She learned to trust her body in ways she never had before, to feel the burn of hard work as accomplishment rather than something to be avoided. And she learned Thade, learned that he was patient when teaching, but exacting in his standards, that he read poetry in the evenings, Longfellow, Whitman, Shakespeare, his voice turning the words into something beautiful. That he talked to himself when he thought she couldn't hear muttering observations about the weather and the animals and the state of his supplies. That he carved small things from wood when his hands needed to be busy: a new comb for her hair, a better handle for the water bucket, a small bird that he set on the windowsill without comment. She learned that beneath the gruff exterior was a man of deep feeling, someone who'd loved completely and lost everything, who'd chosen isolation not because he wanted it, but because the alternative, risking that kind of love again, was unthinkable. And she learned with something between terror and wonder that she was beginning to care for him. It started small. The way her heart lifted when she heard his boots on the cabin steps. The way she found herself watching his hands as he worked, marveling at their capability. The way she laughed at his dry observations about the mountain and its creatures, genuine laughter that she'd forgotten she was capable of. It grew in the evenings when they sat together in the warm circle of firelight, her mending while he read aloud or carved. In the comfortable silences that stretched between them, no longer awkward, but companionable. In the moments when their hands would brush, passing a cup, reaching for the same log, and neither would pull away quite as quickly as propriety demanded. It crystallized one morning in late November when she woke to find him already dressed, preparing to check his trap lines in weather that looked brutal even by Montana standards. "You don't have to go out in that," she said, watching him bundle into layers. "Traps won't check themselves," he replied, "and we need the meat." "Let me come with you." He turned surprised. "It's 10 below out there. Maybe worse with the wind." "Then you shouldn't be out there alone," she said, already reaching for her own coat. "If something happens, if you fall or get caught in a drift, you'll freeze before you make it back. 2 sets of eyes are safer than 1. Something shifted in his expression, resistance giving way to consideration giving way to what might have been respect. "You'll do exactly what I say," he warned. "No arguments, no hesitation. If I tell you to run for the cabin, you run. I promise." "All right then, bundle up. It's going to be cold enough to freeze your breath in your lungs." He wasn't exaggerating. The moment they stepped outside, the cold hit, like a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. But Sarah had learned not to panic, learned to breathe shallow and measured, to keep moving, to generate warmth. They worked the trap line together, Thady showing her how to approach each trap carefully, how to reset them properly, how to dispatch the one rabbit they caught quickly and humanely. It was brutal work in brutal conditions, and by the time they returned to the cabin, Sarah's face was numb, and her fingers ached even inside her gloves. But she'd done it, proven she could survive in conditions that would have killed the Philadelphia version of herself without a second thought. That night, as they warmed themselves by the fire, Thade said quietly, "You did well today, better than most men I've known." The praise, simple and unadorned, meant more to her than any flowery compliment she'd ever received at a society ball. "Thank you for teaching me," she said, "for not giving up on me when I was useless." "You were never useless," he said, "just untrained. There's a difference." Their eyes met across the fire, and Sarah felt the air between them change charge with something that had been building for weeks. She saw him recognize it too, saw the way his expression shifted from comfortable companionship to something more complicated, more dangerous. "Sarah," he said, her name rough in his throat. "I know," she said softly. "I feel it too." But neither of them moved, both understanding instinctively that crossing that line would change everything, and neither was quite ready for that change. Not yet. The moment passed and they returned to their evening routine, but something had shifted between them, some acknowledgement that couldn't be taken back. December came, and with it, the deepest cold Sarah had ever experienced. The kind of cold that made trees explode with rifle crack sounds as their sap froze. The kind that turned exhaled breath to ice crystals that tinkled when they fell. The kind that killed without mercy or warning. But inside the cabin, life continued warmer now for two than it had ever been for one. And on a night when the northern lights painted the sky in ribbons of green and gold, when the cold was so intense that frost formed on the inside of the windows, Sarah finally found the courage to tell Thady the whole truth. "There's something you need to know," she said, her voice steady, despite the fear. "About Augustus. About why he'll never stop looking for me." Thady set down the piece of wood he'd been carving and gave her his full attention. "I'm listening." And as the northern lights danced outside and the fire crackled between them, Sarah told him everything. The words came hard at first, like stones she'd been carrying in her throat for months, sharp-edged and heavy. But once Sarah started speaking, she couldn't stop. "Augustus Thornhill didn't just want to marry me," she said, her voice low and controlled. "He needed to. His father's railroad company had overextended itself during the expansion, made investments that didn't pay off. They needed capital, needed it desperately. My father held shares in the Pennsylvania line worth nearly $100,000, and my dowry would have transferred those shares to the Thornhill holdings." Thade remained silent, his eyes never leaving her face. "My father died 6 months before the wedding. Heart failure, the doctor said, though. I think it was the stress of keeping his business afloat. Everything went into probate, but the marriage contract stood. Augustus assured me that once we were married, he'd make sure my sister Grace was taken care of, that my mother would want for nothing. He presented it as chivalry, as him stepping in to save my family from financial ruin." She laughed, a bitter sound that had no humor in it. "I believed him. God help me, I actually believed him, right up until the engagement party when I found him in his study with the actual contract. Not the marriage agreement, but the business documents. He'd already forged my signature on papers transferring the shares to him upon marriage. But there were other papers too, ones I wasn't supposed to see. Papers that would declare me mentally unstable, unfit to manage my own affairs should I prove difficult." Thade's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. I confronted him, told him I knew what he was planning, that I wouldn't go through with the wedding. That's when his mask came off completely. Her hands trembled as she reached for her coffee cup, the liquid inside long since gone cold. He locked the study door, told me that I'd already cost him 6 months of waiting, that the shares were his by right of our engagement, and if I wouldn't give them willingly, he'd take them another way. He said, she swallowed hard. He said that wives who proved troublesome could be committed to asylums quite easily, especially when their husbands were men of influence. But first, he needed to make sure the marriage was legal, consummated, binding. The word hung in the air like a curse. He hit me when I tried to get to the door, backhanded me hard enough that I saw stars. Then he grabbed my arms, you saw the bruises, and he started tearing at my dress. If his mother hadn't knocked on the door at that exact moment, if she hadn't needed him for some trivial matter with the caterers— Sarah's voice finally broke, and she looked away, unable to meet Thade's eyes. I didn't go back to my room that night. I went to Grace, told her everything, and she helped me escape. Gave me every penny she'd saved, helped me get to the train station before dawn. The last thing she said to me was, "Run far enough that he can never find you." So I did. I ran until I couldn't run anymore, until I ended up in your trapline, half frozen and ready to die rather than go back. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the fire seemed to burn quieter, as if the cabin itself was holding its breath. When Thade finally spoke, his voice was rough with barely controlled fury. "This man, Augustus Thornhill, he put his hands on you. He tried to force himself on you. And then you had to flee across half a continent because he decided you were his property." It wasn't a question, but Sarah nodded anyway. "There's more," she said quietly. "Grace sent a letter to the trading post in Bannock before I left Philadelphia. It arrived 2 weeks ago, but Isaac Bell only brought it up yesterday when you went down for supplies. I haven't told you because I was afraid, but you deserve to know." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper worn soft from repeated reading. "Augustus reported me as a fugitive. He claimed I stole bearer bonds from his family safe bonds worth $150,000. He has a federal warrant issued for my arrest, and he's hired men to find me. Professional men. Bounty hunters." She handed him the letter, watched his face as he read Grace's careful handwriting, the warning written in desperate haste. "Dearest Sarah, Augustus knows you went west. He's hired a man named Vance Cutler. They say he tracked Jesse James for the Pinkertons before going private. Cutler has a reputation for always getting his bounty. Always. Father's estate lawyer tried to fight the warrant, but Augustus has judges in his pocket. The charges are fabricated, but that won't matter if they find you. Please, please be careful. Destroy this letter after you read it. I love you. Grace." Thade read the letter twice, his expression growing darker with each pass. When he finally looked up, Sarah saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch, not fear or anger, but cold, calculating assessment. The lawman he used to be, evaluating a tactical situation. "Vance Cutler," he said slowly. "I know that name. He worked the Montana Territory about 10 years back before he went east to join the Pinkertons. Good tracker, relentless, and utterly without scruples about who he brings in or how he does it." "Then you understand," Sarah said, her voice hollow. "It's only a matter of time. Even up here, eventually he'll find me. He'll piece together the route I took to enough people, offer enough money. Someone will remember the Eastern lady who came through in October. Someone will point him toward Bannock, and Isaac Bell will remember the woman's supplies went to up the mountain. And then he'll come here," Thade finished. "Through snow, through cold, through whatever it takes, because $10,000 is enough money to make a man brave." "I should leave," Sarah said, even though the words tore at her. "Before he gets close, before he puts you in danger too. I've already brought you enough trouble. Stop." The single word, quiet but absolute, cut through her rising panic. "You're not leaving," Thade said. "Not in the middle of winter, not with armed men potentially looking for you, and sure as hell not because you think you're protecting me by running. But, Sarah," he leaned forward, his eyes intense, "I spent 7 years on this mountain telling myself I was done protecting people, done caring whether anyone lived or died. You showing up half-frozen on my doorstep that was supposed to be temporary. A good deed, a winter's charity, and then you'd be gone come spring, and I could go back to my careful isolation." He stood, moved to the window, stared out at the white landscape that had become his fortress. "But you didn't stay temporary. You learned everything I taught you. You worked harder than most men I've known. You sat with me in the evenings and listened to my stories about Lydia and the boys without pity, without trying to fix me, just listening. You made this cabin feel less like a tomb and more like a home." He turned back to face her, and she saw raw vulnerability in his expression. "I'm not letting some Philadelphia dandy and his hired gun take that away. Not without a fight." "Thade, you don't understand what you're saying. These aren't reasonable men. They won't negotiate, won't accept that I'm not going back. And if you get in their way, then I get in their way," he said simply. "Wouldn't be the first time I've faced down bad men, and it probably won't be the last. But I'll face them here on ground I know with every advantage I can muster." He crossed to his gun cabinet, unlocked it with a key he kept on a chain around his neck. Inside were weapons Sarah had seen but never examined closely, a shotgun, revolvers, and boxes of ammunition stacked neatly on shelves. "I was a United States Marshal for 12 years, Thady said, pulling out a rifle and checking its action with practiced efficiency. Tracked outlaws through the Dakotas, chased bank robbers across Nebraska, faced down claim jumpers in Colorado. I know how to defend what's mine." "I'm not yours to defend," Sarah said softly. He paused the rifle in his hands and met her eyes. "Aren't you?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications neither had been willing to voice until now. Sarah felt her heart hammering against her ribs, felt the weight of the moment pressing down. "I don't know what I am anymore," she admitted. "I left Philadelphia as one person and survived the mountain as someone else entirely. I don't know if the woman I'm becoming has any right to ask you to fight for her." "Then let me be clear," Thade said, setting the rifle aside and crossing to stand before her. "I'm not fighting for some idea of who you used to be or who you might become. I'm fighting for the woman who sits by my fire every night. The woman who learned to split wood even though it made her hands bleed. The woman who insisted on coming out in 10 below weather to check trap lines because she was worried I'd freeze alone." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and brushed a strand of dark hair from her face. "I'm fighting for you, Sarah Marlowe, exactly as you are, and I'm not asking your permission." She should pull back, should maintain the careful distance they'd preserved for weeks, should remember that this was temporary, that spring would come, and she'd need to leave, that getting close to him would only make the leaving harder. Instead, she leaned into his touch, closed her eyes, and let herself feel safe for the first time since the night she fled Philadelphia. "Then teach me," she whispered. "Teach me how to fight with you." The next morning began before dawn, just as every morning did, but with new purpose. Thade pulled out the Winchester rifle he'd been cleaning the night before and set it on the table beside Sarah's breakfast. "You've learned to shoot targets," he said. "Now you learn to shoot to survive. There's a difference." They spent the morning in the clearing behind the cabin, Sarah's breath frosting in the pre-dawn cold, as Thade put her through drills that made target practice look like child's play. "Someone's shooting at you," he said, his voice clipped and professional. "You've got 3 seconds to acquire target and return fire. Where do you aim?" "Center, mass," Sarah said, bringing the rifle to her shoulder with the fluid motion that weeks of practice had taught her. "Why, biggest target, most likely to stop them. And if they're wearing heavy winter coats, might not penetrate deep enough. Try again. Hip shot, breaks the pelvis, drops them immediately. Better. Now show me." She fired the rifle's recoil, familiar now, almost comfortable. The stick-figure target Thade had set up took the shot low and left just where he'd taught her to aim. "Again," he said. "Faster this time. You won't have leisure to line up a perfect shot when leads flying." They drilled until her shoulder ached from the rifle's kick and her fingers were numb despite her gloves. But when Thade finally called a halt, she could acquire and fire in under 2 seconds, could reload without looking, could transition from rifle to the pistol he'd given her, an old Navy Colt worn, but reliable with fluid efficiency that would have been unimaginable 3 months ago. "You're good," he said, and coming from him, the simple praise felt like a medal of valor. "Not great yet, but good enough to make someone think twice about rushing you. That might be enough. And if it's not, then you run like hell and let me deal with them. I'm not running and leaving you to—" "Yes, you are." His voice was flat, brooking no argument. "Because if it comes to a fight, the best thing you can do is not be a target they can use against me. You think I'll fight smart if they've got you at gunpoint. You think I won't do something stupid to keep you alive?" The admission that he cared enough to compromise his own safety for hers stole the protest from her lips. "All right," she said quietly, "but only if there's no other choice." "Fair enough." They spent the afternoon on other preparations. Thade showed her the hidden cave system a 1/4 mile from the cabin, accessible through a narrow defile that would be invisible under snow to anyone who didn't know exactly where to look. "I've got supplies cached here," he said, lighting a torch to illuminate the small cavern. Enough food for 2 weeks, water, ammunition, blankets. If something happens to the cabin, if we get separated, you come here and wait. Understand. Sarah memorized the landmarks he pointed out. The lightning-struck pine split down the middle like a giant's axe had cleaved it. The 3 boulders arranged in a triangle that looked almost deliberate, the particular way the ridgeline notched against the sky like a broken tooth. "And if you don't come," she asked, her voice smaller than she wanted it to be, "then you wait 3 days. On the 4th day, you take what you can carry and head northeast. Follow the ridgeline until you hit the old Trapper Trail. You'll know it by the blazes cut into the trees, 3 parallel slashes about head height. Follow that north for 2 days, and you'll reach the Crow Winter Camp. Chief Plenty Coos knows me, trades with me regular. Tell him Thady Crow sent you, and he'll get you safe to Bannock or wherever you want to go." He said it matter-of-factly, as if planning for his own death was just another aspect of winter preparation, like stacking firewood or salting meat. "I don't like this plan," Sarah said. "Don't have to like it, just have to remember it." That evening, as they sat by the fire, Thade pulled out a worn leather journal and began writing with careful, deliberate strokes. Sarah had seen him write in it before, usually observations about weather or notes on the season's game, but never with such intensity. "What are you writing?" she asked. "Everything I know about Vance Cutler," he said without looking up. "His methods, his patterns, how he thinks. If he's coming for you, I need to be 3 steps ahead of him." He wrote for over an hour, filling page after page with cramped handwriting, occasionally pausing to stare into the fire as he pulled memories from 12 years of law enforcement. "Cutler's smart," Thady said, finally setting down his pen. "Smarter than most bounty hunters, which makes him dangerous. He won't come rushing up the mountain in the dead of winter. Too risky, too many ways it could go wrong. He'll wait until the weather breaks late February or early March, when the worst of the snow is past, but the passes aren't clear yet. Trap us here, but give himself escape routes." "How do you know?" "Because it's what I'd do." He closed the journal, his expression distant. "He'll scout first. Send someone up, maybe Isaac Bell, maybe a hired local with some pretext. See how many people are here, what kind of defenses we have, whether there's actually a woman matching the description. Then he'll come with enough men to overwhelm resistance, but not so many that they're unwieldy in snow. 3, maybe 4, including himself. And then we see if all this preparation was worth a damn." The days grew shorter as December deepened into January. The sun, when it appeared at all, traced a low arc across the southern sky, providing light but little warmth. The thermometer Thade kept nailed to the cabin wall regularly dropped below 0, sometimes falling to 20 or 30 below, when the wind screamed down from the peaks like something alive and vengeful. But inside the cabin, warmth grew in ways that had nothing to do with the fire. It happened in increments, small intimacies that accumulated like snowdrift. Sarah's hand on Thade's shoulder as she passed behind him, the touch lingering a moment longer than necessary. His fingers brushing her wrist when he handed her coffee, the contact sending warmth up her arm that had nothing to do with the hot liquid. The way they'd started sitting closer together in the evenings, their bodies drawn together by something more than shared warmth until sometimes their shoulders touched and neither pulled away. One night, as Thade read aloud from Longfellow, his voice turning "The Song of Hiawatha" into something primal and beautiful, Sarah found herself watching his face instead of listening to the words, studying the way firelight caught in his beard turned gray to silver. The permanent lines around his eyes earned by years of squinting into sun and distance. The scar that ran from his left eyebrow into his hairline, a souvenir from some long-ago violence he'd never explained. He was 48 years old, marked by loss and hardship and isolation. He should have seemed old to her, weathered and worn beyond his years. Instead, he seemed real in a way no man in her previous life ever had. "You're not listening," he said, glancing up from the book, catching her staring. "No," she admitted, "I'm not." "What are you doing then? Wondering how I got so lucky to end up here with you instead of frozen dead in the snow. Or worse, back in Philadelphia in Augustus's keeping. Thade set the book aside, his expression serious. Luck had nothing to do with it. You ran when you needed to run. You survived when you needed to survive. You learned when you needed to learn. That's not luck, Sarah. That's strength. I don't feel strong. Most days I feel terrified and barely holding together. That's what strong looks like, he said quietly. Being terrified and doing the hard thing anyway. Falling apart and putting yourself back together every morning, that's the only kind of strength that matters out here. She moved then, closing the small distance between them on the rough wooden bench until she was close enough to feel the heat of him through layers of wool and flannel. Thade, she said softly, I need you to understand something. When spring comes, when the pass is clear and I can leave, I don't know if I'll want to. His breath caught barely audible, but she heard it. You can't stay here, he said, but there was no conviction in the words. This isn't a life for someone like you, this isolation, this hardship, someone like me. She almost laughed. I'm not that person anymore. I'm not the Philadelphia debutante who thought roughing it meant staying in a hotel without a private bath. I've split firewood and skinned rabbits and learned to read weather in the bones of the sky. I've become someone who could survive up here, someone who wants to. It's the cabin fever talking, Thade said, but he didn't pull away when she placed her hand over his. Come spring, when you remember what civilization looks like, what options you have, will you stop telling me what I want? The sharpness in her voice surprised them both. You don't get to decide that this is temporary, that I'll wake up one day and realize I've made a mistake. Maybe I will. Maybe come April I'll be desperate for a hot bath and a soft bed and people who don't smell like wood smoke. But maybe I won't. Maybe I'll have found something here worth more than all of that. Sarah, I'm falling in love with you, Thaddeus Crow. The words came out stark and simple, too honest to take back even if she wanted to. They hung in the air between them as real and undeniable as the cold outside. Thade stared at her, his gray eyes wide with something that looked like panic and hope warring for dominance. You can't, he said hoarsely. You can't love me. I'm broken, Sarah. I've been broken for 7 years. I've got nothing to offer you but this cabin and this mountain, and a heart that already gave everything it had to people who are in the ground. I don't want everything, Sarah said, her hand tightening on his. I just want whatever you have left, even if it's broken. Even if it's scared, I'll take it. You don't know what you're asking. Then tell me. Tell me why I shouldn't love you. Give me a reason that isn't you trying to protect me from yourself. He was silent for a long moment, his jaw working as he fought some internal battle. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw with old grief. Because everyone I've ever loved has died. My parents dead of cholera when I was 16. Lydia and the boys murdered because I cared more about catching outlaws than keeping them safe. Every person I've let matter the mountain takes. That's why I can't, why we can't. The mountain didn't take me, Sarah said gently. You did. You pulled me back from the edge, and you taught me how to survive. You gave me a reason to keep fighting when it would have been easier to just lie down in the snow and let it end. And yes, maybe loving me scares you. Maybe it should scare me too with everything that's coming, but I'm tired of running from things that scare me. I've been running my whole life. She shifted closer until she could feel his breath on her face, could see the conflict written in every line of his weathered features. Kiss me, she whispered, or tell me to stop, but don't tell me what I can or can't feel. For a heartbeat, she thought he'd pull away. Thought 7 years of isolation and grief would win out over whatever fragile thing was building between them. Then his hand came up to cup her face, calloused and gentle, and he kissed her like a man who'd forgotten how, but was desperate to remember. It wasn't the practiced kiss of a society gentleman or the fumbling attempt of a boy. It was raw and hesitant and achingly real, tasting of coffee and loneliness and the beginning of hope. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Thade rested his forehead against hers. God help me, he said roughly. I'm falling too. Have been since you looked at me with those stubborn eyes and told me you could learn. I just didn't want to admit it." "Then don't fight it," Sarah said. "Let it happen. Let us happen." "Sarah, when Cutler comes, then we'll face him together. But until then, can we have this, whatever this is, ma?" Thady pulled back enough to look at her properly, his hand still cradling her face like something precious and fragile. "I don't know how to do this halfway," he admitted. "If I let myself love you, it'll be all in, complete. The kind of love that makes a man stupid and brave and willing to burn down the world to keep you safe. And that kind of love, it's dangerous, Sarah, for both of us." "I know," she said. "I'm counting on it." He kissed her again, deeper this time, with the desperation of a man who'd been alone too long and the tenderness of one who knew how fragile this moment was. And when he finally drew back, his eyes held a light that hadn't been there before. "All right then," he said. "We do this, together, whatever comes." "Whatever comes," she echoed. That night they still slept in separate spaces, propriety and caution, both dictating distance, but something fundamental had changed. The cabin that had been a fortress against connection had become a sanctuary for it instead. And outside, unknown to them, the first pieces of their reckoning were already in motion. In Bannock, 3 days' ride down the mountain, a man named Vance Cutler stepped off the stage and into the trading post, brushing snow from his expensive coat. He was 42 years old, lean and hard as winter itself, with eyes that missed nothing and a smile that never reached them. "I'm looking for Isaac Bell," he said to the clerk, his voice cultured and cold. "I understand he does supply runs into the high country." The clerk, who'd been about to close for the evening, straightened. "Mr. Bell's not here right now. Can I give him a message?" Cutler pulled a photograph from his coat pocket, laying it on the counter with deliberate care. It showed a young woman in formal dress, her dark hair perfectly arranged, her expression carefully composed for the camera. The woman in the photograph looked nothing like the person Sarah had become, but her eyes were the same. "Have you seen this woman? She would have come through here in October. Alone, probably. Dressed inappropriately for the climate." The clerk studied the photograph, recognition flickering across his face before he could hide it. "Can't say as I have," he lied. But Cutler saw the tell, the slight widening of pupils, the momentary tension in his jaw. "Of course." Cutler smiled, the expression not reaching his eyes. "If you do remember anything, there's $1,000 in it for information. 2,000 if it leads me to her." He laid a card on the counter next to the photograph, the expensive cardstock embossed with his name and a Denver address. "I'll be staying at the hotel. Mr. Bell can find me there when he returns." After Cutler left, the clerk stared at the photograph for a long moment, then at the card with its promise of more money than he'd see in 5 years of honest work. $2,000 for the location of one woman who probably didn't want to be found. He thought about his wife, about the baby coming in spring, about the roof that needed repairs and the debts that needed paying. Thought about the kind of man who offered that much money for one person and what that might mean for the woman if he found her. Then he took the photograph and the card and locked them in his desk drawer, made his decision, and went home to his pregnant wife. But in a town the size of Bannock, secrets didn't stay secret long, and $2,000 was enough to make men brave, or at least willing to sell their conscience for the price of comfort. The word was already spreading. Up in the high country, in a cabin warmed by more than fire, Sarah and Thady sat together in peaceful ignorance, stealing what happiness they could before the storm broke. They had until spring, they thought. They had weeks at best. And when Vance Cutler finally came for what he'd been hired to collect, he would come with all the cold efficiency that had made him the most feared bounty hunter in 3 territories. The mountain winter had given them time to grow close. Now it would test whether that closeness was strong enough to survive what was coming. The warning came on a morning in late February when the worst of winter's fury had passed, but spring remained a distant promise. Thade had gone down the mountain to meet Isaac Bell at their usual rendezvous point, a sheltered hollow 3 miles from the cabin where the trader left supplies rather than risk the final brutal ascent. Sarah waited in the cabin, rifle across her knees, watching the tree line the way Thade had taught her. Always watching, always ready. When Thade returned 2 hours later, his face was grim as winter itself. "We've got trouble," he said, not bothering with preamble. "Isaac brought news along with the supplies. Vance Cutler's in Bannock. Has been for 3 weeks. Sarah's blood went cold. "Does he know I'm here?" "Not for certain, but he's asking questions, showing your photograph, offering money. Enough money that someone will talk eventually." Thade set down the supply sacks, his movements tense with controlled urgency. "Isaac says Cutler's smart, hasn't mentioned your name, hasn't said why he wants you. Just that there's a federal warrant and a substantial reward. Playing it like routine law enforcement." "How long do we have?" "Isaac thinks maybe a week before Cutler pieces together enough to try the mountain. Weather's warming not much, but enough that a determined man with good gear could make the climb." Thade moved to the gun cabinet, began checking weapons with practiced efficiency. "We need to decide. Now. Do you run, or do we stand?" Sarah looked around the cabin that had become home, thought about the life they'd begun building in these rough walls, thought about the man who'd taught her that survival and living weren't the same thing. "I'm not running anymore," she said quietly. "I ran from Philadelphia. I ran all the way to Montana. I'm done running." Thade's hand stilled on the rifle he was cleaning. "You understand what that means if Cutler comes, if it turns to violence, then it turns to violence." Her voice was steady, surprising herself with its certainty. "You've taught me to shoot, to think tactically, to survive in conditions that would kill most people. Now teach me to fight." Something shifted in Thade's expression, respect mixing with a fear that had nothing to do with his own safety and everything to do with hers. "All right," he said, "then we prepare for war." The next 3 days were a blur of controlled preparation. Thade approached it like the lawman he'd been, tactical and methodical, thinking 3 steps ahead of an enemy who hadn't yet shown his face. "Cutler will scout first," Thade said as they worked. "Send someone up to assess the situation without committing himself. Probably offer Isaac Bell money to make a supply run, see if he notices anything unusual." They moved supplies from the cabin to the hidden cave, creating a fallback position stocked with food, ammunition, and medical supplies. Thade showed Sarah how to set simple alarm strings with bells attached arranged across likely approach routes. "Won't stop them," he explained, "but it'll give us warning, seconds, maybe minutes. That's the difference between surprise and preparation." He walked her through the terrain around the cabin, pointing out defensive positions and kill zones with the clinical detachment of someone who'd done this before. "If shooting starts, you go to ground here." He indicated a depression behind a cluster of boulders. "Good sight lines, downslope protection on 3 sides. You can hold this position against multiple attackers if you have to. And where will you be? Drawing fire. Making them focus on me instead of you." "Thade, no arguments." His voice was flat absolute. "I'm better trained, better experienced, and expendable. You're not. If this goes wrong, you get to that cave and you wait 3 days like we planned. Then you run. Promise me." Sarah wanted to argue, wanted to tell him that she wouldn't leave him, that they'd face this together or not at all. But she saw the look in his eyes, the same look she'd seen when he talked about Lydia and the boys, and knew this wasn't negotiable. "I promise," she lied, and hoped he couldn't tell. On the 4th day, Isaac Bell made his appearance right on schedule. They heard his horse long before they saw him, the sound of hooves breaking through crusted snow, carrying in the thin mountain air. Thade met him 50 yards from the cabin, rifle casually held but ready. Sarah watched from the window, her own weapon loaded and close. "Didn't expect to see you again so soon, Isaac," Thade called out. The trader looked uncomfortable, his gaze sliding away from direct eye contact. "Got an urgent order request from down in Bannock. Fellow willing to pay triple the usual rate for a rush delivery." "What kind of fellow?" "Didn't catch his name." Eastern type, well-dressed. Said he was a federal marshal, showed credentials and everything. Show you a photograph too. Thade's voice was deceptively mild. Isaac's discomfort deepened. He did. Young woman, dark hair. Said she was wanted for theft back east. Asked if I'd seen anyone matching her description come through last fall. And what did you tell him? Told him the truth, that I make supply runs all through these mountains. See lots of people. Hard to remember one from 4 months back. Isaac finally met Thade's eyes. But he's persistent, Thade. Offering serious money. $2,000 just for information about her whereabouts. There's men in Bannock who'd sell their own mothers for half that. Did you take his money, Isaac? No. The word came out firm, almost offended. You've been a good customer for 7 years. More than that, you helped me when those claim jumpers tried to run me off my route back in '79. I don't forget debts like that. Thade's posture relaxed slightly. I appreciate that. And I'm asking you to forget you ever saw anyone up here besides a hermit who likes his solitude. Already forgotten, Isaac said. But Thade, you need to know this marshal, or whatever he is, he's not giving up. He's hiring local men, planning to search every cabin, every line shack, every possible shelter between here and the Idaho border. Even if I don't talk, someone else will. It's just a matter of time. How much time? Week, maybe 2. Weather's still rough enough to slow them down, but it's warming. Come March, they'll be able to move freely. Isaac shifted in his saddle, clearly uncomfortable with what he was about to say. There's one more thing. He's not alone. Brought 3 men with him, professional types, the kind who know which end of a gun does the damage. 4 men total. Thade had guessed 3 or 4. Not a surprise, but confirmation settled like lead in his gut. Thanks for the warning, Isaac. What do I owe you for the supplies? Consider it paid, for old time's sake. Isaac gathered his reins, preparing to leave. Be careful, Thade. This man, there's something cold about him, like he doesn't care about right or wrong, just about finishing the job. Those are the dangerous ones. After Isaac left, Thade returned to the cabin where Sarah waited. You heard. She nodded. 4 men, a week, maybe 2. It's really happening. It is. Thade moved to the window, staring out at the white landscape that had been his fortress and was about to become his battlefield. I need to tell you something about Vance Cutler, about what kind of man we're facing. He poured coffee, handed her a cup, and settled into the chair across from her. 12 years ago, I was working a case in the Dakota Territory. Bank robbery, 3 men dead. The gang split up, made tracking them harder. I was assigned to follow one of them, a kid really couldn't have been more than 20. Name was Daniel Curtis. Thade's voice grew distant, remembering. I tracked him for 2 weeks, finally caught up with him in a line shack outside of Deadwood. He surrendered without a fight, seemed almost relieved to be caught. On the ride back to stand trial, he told me why he'd done it. His sister needed medicine. Expensive medicine his family couldn't afford. The robbery was supposed to be easy, no one supposed to get hurt, but his partners panicked when a clerk went for a gun, and suddenly 3 men were dead and Daniel was running for his life. What happened to him? Never made it to trial. Vance Cutler was tracking him too. The bank had put up a separate bounty, dead or alive. Cutler found us camped one night, put a bullet in Daniel's head while he slept, and claimed the reward. Didn't matter that I'd already arrested him, that I was bringing him in legally. Dead or alive means dead is easier. Thade's hands tightened on his cup. I reported it. Testified that it was an execution, not a lawful killing. But Cutler had friends, had connections. Nothing came of it. He kept his bounty and his reputation, and I learned that there are men in this world who see human beings as currency, items to be collected and cashed in. And now that man is coming for me, Sarah said quietly. Yes. Which means we can't expect mercy, can't expect him to care about your side of the story. He's been paid to bring you back, and he'll do it by whatever means necessary. Thade met her eyes. That's why you need to understand, if it comes to a fight, I won't be trying to wound or disable. I'll be shooting to kill, because Cutler will be doing the same, and hesitation is how good people die. The weight of it settled over them both, the understanding that violence was no longer theoretical but inevitable. "I'm scared," Sarah admitted. "Not of dying exactly, but of losing this, losing you. We've only just found each other." Thade crossed to her, pulled her into his arms, held her like she was the only thing keeping him anchored to the earth. "I spent 7 years telling myself I was dead inside," he said against her hair. "That I'd buried my heart with Lydia and the boys and would never feel anything again. You proved me wrong. You made me want to live instead of just survive. And I'll be damned if I let some hired gun take that away." They stood together in the warm circle of firelight, taking comfort in each other's presence, knowing that the days ahead would test everything they'd built. That night, for the first time, they shared a bed, not for passion, but for comfort, for the simple human need to not be alone when fear whispered in the darkness. They lay together, fully clothed, Sarah's back against Thade's chest, his arm wrapped protectively around her waist. "Tell me about after," she said softly. "After this is over, after we've won. What happens then? What do you want to happen? I want to stay here, with you. Learn to tend the trap lines in spring, help with the garden you mentioned, planting. Maybe ride down to Bannock once a month for supplies, just so we're not completely cut off from the world, but mostly I just want this. Us, a life that's simple and hard and real." Thade's arm tightened around her. "I'd like that too, more than I can say." He paused, then added quietly, "There's something else I've been thinking about. The cabin's small, built for one, but it could be expanded, added onto. Room for, well, for a family, if that's something you wanted. Someday." Sarah's breath caught. "You'd want that after everything you lost?" "Terrifies me," he admitted. "The thought of caring that much again, of having something that could be taken away. But you've taught me that hiding from life isn't the same as protecting yourself from pain. And I'd rather risk the hurt than miss the chance to build something worth protecting." She turned in his arms, found his face in the darkness, kissed him with a tenderness that spoke of promises they weren't quite ready to voice, but both understood. "Then we fight," she said. "We fight for that future, and we win. We win," he agreed. They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, stealing what peace they could before the storm broke. 5 days later, they came. Sarah spotted them first. 4 riders moving slowly through the snow, still 2 miles distant, but heading directly for the cabin, with the purposeful pace of men who knew exactly where they were going. "Thade," she called, her voice steady, despite the adrenaline flooding her system, "we've got company." He was at the window in seconds, rifle already in hand, assessing the situation with cold, tactical precision. 4 riders, just like Isaac said. Spread out in a loose line, they're not sure exactly where the cabin is, but they're close. He watched them for another moment, then made his decision. "Get your coat. We're moving to the fallback position. The cave. Not yet. The rock outcrop I showed you, the one with good sight lines on the cabin approach. If they're smart, they'll stop and scout before they commit. I want to see how they operate, see if there's a chance we can end this without bloodshed." Sarah doubted there was, but she grabbed her coat and rifle anyway, followed Thade out the back of the cabin into the deep snow. They'd practiced this route a dozen times over the past week, and even in her fear, her body moved with trained efficiency. The outcrop was a cluster of massive boulders 200 yards upslope from the cabin, offering protection and elevation. They settled into position, Thade with his Winchester, Sarah with the Henry rifle he deemed her more accurate with. "Remember," Thade said quietly, "you don't fire unless I fire first. And if I tell you to run, you run. No arguments, no hesitation." "Understood. Understood," she said, and meant it this time. They waited. The 4 riders emerged from the tree line, and even at this distance, Sarah could see they were professionals. They moved with military precision, weapons ready, but not aggressive, scanning the terrain with practiced eyes. The lead rider, lean, dark-haired, dressed in quality cold-weather gear, had to be Vance Cutler. He raised a hand, signaling halt, and the 4 men stopped 50 yards from the cabin. Thaddeus Crow, Cutler's voice carried clearly in the cold air, cultured and reasonable. I know you're out there. I'm Deputy U.S. Marshal Vance Cutler, and I'm here on federal business. I'd like to speak with you. Just talk. No need for this to get unpleasant. Thade didn't respond, simply watched, assessing. I'm looking for a woman named Serafina Marlowe, Cutler continued. She's wanted on federal charges theft of bearer bonds valued at $150,000. I have a lawful warrant for her arrest. If you're harboring her, you're committing a federal crime. But if you cooperate, turn her over peacefully, there'll be no charges against you. You have my word. The word of a man who shot a sleeping prisoner in the head, Thade thought bitterly. I'm going to approach the cabin now, Cutler called. Unarmed hands visible. I just want to talk. Whatever you've been told about me, whatever you think this is about, I'm just a lawman doing his job. There's no need for anyone to get hurt. He dismounted slowly, deliberately, made a show of unbuckling his gun belt and hanging it on his saddle. Then he walked toward the cabin, hands raised and empty. Thade's finger tightened on the trigger. One shot from this distance with this rifle, he could end it right now. Cutler would be dead before he heard the report, and the other three would scatter or surrender. But it would make him a murderer. And for all his preparations, all his talk about shooting to kill Thade, wasn't sure he could pull that trigger in cold blood. Not yet. Cutler reached the cabin, tried the door, found it unlocked. He disappeared inside for a full minute while his men waited tense and ready. When he emerged, his expression had changed from reasonable to calculating. Well now, he called out, addressing the forest itself. Cabin's warm. Fire's been tended recently. 2 cups on the table. 2 sets of clothes. Looks like someone's been sharing this space, Mr. Crow. You want to tell me who you're protecting? Still Thade remained silent. Cutler's patience visibly thinned. I'm trying to be civilized about this, but I've got a legal warrant, and I've got the authority to search every structure within 100 miles if necessary. You can make this easy, or you can make it hard. But either way, I'm not leaving here without Serafina Marlowe. He turned back toward his horse, and Thade saw him make a subtle gesture to his men. That's when everything went wrong. The 3 riders spread out, encircling the cabin, rifles coming up. This wasn't a search anymore. It was a siege. Last chance, Crow. Cutler shouted back behind cover, now gun belt mysteriously returned to his waist. Send the woman out, and you walk away from this. Keep protecting her, and we'll burn you out. Your choice. You've got 1 minute. Thade looked at Sarah, saw the fear and determination warring in her eyes, saw her hands steady on her rifle despite the terror he knew she must be feeling. I love you, he said quietly. No matter what happens next, I need you to know that. I love you too, she whispered back. Then Thade stood, rifle held casually, and called out in a voice that carried all his years of authority as a lawman. Vance Cutler, I know you, know what you are. You're no marshal, federal or otherwise. You're a bounty hunter with a fabricated warrant and a rich man's money backing you. And the woman you're looking for isn't here. A gamble. A desperate, necessary lie. Cutler's laugh was cold. Come now, Crow. I've been tracking fugitives longer than you've been playing hermit. I know she's here. I can see the evidence. 2 sets of everything supplies for 2 people. Isaac Bell might not have talked, but he didn't need to. The pattern tells the story. Then you've wasted a trip. The woman who was here left 3 weeks ago, headed west toward Idaho Territory, paid me for supplies and information, then moved on. You want her? You're looking in the wrong mountains. Prove it. Come down here, let me search the cabin properly. If she's gone like you say, you've got nothing to hide. I've got everything to hide, Thade shot back. My privacy, my solitude, my right to live on my land without harassment from hired guns pretending to be lawmen. You want to search, go get a real warrant from a real judge. Until then, you're trespassing. And in Montana Territory, a man's got a right to defend his property. The standoff stretched tense seconds ticking by like hours. Then Cutler made his mistake. Burn it, he ordered his men. If she's in there, she'll come out or die. Either way, we collect. One of the riders pulled out a torch, and Thade knew with terrible certainty that talking was over. He fired. The shot took the man with the torch in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him into the snow. The torch fell, sputtered, died in the wet snow. Immediately the clearing erupted in gunfire. Cutler and his remaining men returned fire bullets whining off the rocks around Thady and Sarah's position. But they were shooting blind, unsure of the exact location, while Thade had the high ground and clear sight lines. "Aim for the horses," Thade shouted to Sarah over the chaos. "Make them choose between pursuit and escape." She fired, missed, fired again. Her third shot caught one of the horses in the flank, not fatal, but enough to send it bucking and screaming. The rider fought for control, and in that moment of distraction, Thade's bullet found him center mass, dropping him from the saddle. 2 down, but Cutler and his remaining man had found cover behind a fallen log, and now they laid down, suppressing fire with disciplined precision. These weren't amateurs, they were professionals, and they'd been in firefights before. "Flank left," Cutler ordered his man. "I'll keep them pinned." Thade saw the tactic immediately. One man draws attention, while the other circles around to attack from a new angle. "Sarah, the man moving left. I see him." She tracked him through her sights, remembered everything Thade had taught her. Breathe. Lead the target. Squeeze. Don't pull. She fired. The bullet caught the flanking man in the leg, shattering his knee. He went down screaming, and his screams echoed off the mountainside like an accusation. "You all right?" Thade asked, his eyes never leaving Cutler's position. "I shot him," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "I actually shot him." "You saved our lives. No shame in that." But Thade could hear the trauma in her voice, knew that taking a human life, even in self-defense, would mark her. Later, if there was a later, they'd deal with that. For now, survival trumped conscience. Cutler had stopped firing. The silence was almost worse than the gunfire. "You've killed 2 of my men," he shouted. "Wounded. A third? That's murder crow. You've just signed your own death warrant." "Self-defense," Thade called back. "You came to burn me out. I've got a witness who'll testify to that." "What witness? The fugitive you're harboring?" "You think a federal court will believe her word over mine. I think you're not a federal anything, and we both know it. You're a hired killer with a fake badge. And when this is over, when the real law gets involved, the truth's going to come out." Another silence, this one calculating. Then Cutler's voice changed, became almost conversational. "You're good, Crow. Better than I expected. But you've got limited ammunition up there, and eventually you'll run dry. I can wait. Can you?" He was right, and they both knew it. Thade had maybe 40 rounds left. Sarah had 30. Enough for a sustained firefight, but not for a siege. "Thade?" Sarah whispered. "What do we do?" He'd been thinking the same question, running scenarios, looking for options that didn't end with both of them dead or captured. "The cave," he said finally. "We fall back to the cave. It's defensible, has supplies, and only one entrance they'd have to come through. We can hold there long enough for help to arrive." "What help?" "Isaac Bell's due back in a week. When he sees bodies in my front yard, he'll ride for the territorial marshal in Helena. We just have to survive until then." It was a thin hope, but it was hope. "On my signal," Thady said. "We move, fast and low. I'll cover you, then follow. Ready." Sarah nodded, her face pale but determined. "Now." They broke from cover, running low across the open ground toward the tree line. Cutler's rifle cracked bullets, kicking up snow around their feet, but they were moving targets now, harder to hit. They crashed into the forest, and Thade turned, firing twice to cover their retreat. Then they were running, following the path they'd memorized, racing toward the cave, while behind them Cutler rallied his remaining man for pursuit. The chase was on. They reached the cave entrance, the narrow defile that looked like nothing but a crack in the rock face, and squeezed through into the darkness beyond. Thady lit the torch they'd cached there, and the small cavern sprang into view, stocked with everything they'd need for a last stand. "Help me with this," Thade said, moving to a boulder near the entrance. Together they rolled it across part of the opening, narrowing the entrance to a gap barely wide enough for one man at a time. They'll have to come through single file, Thade explained, breathing hard. Gives us every advantage. They won't risk it, not in the dark, not without knowing what they're facing. So we wait, we wait. They settled in rifles trained on the narrow entrance and began the longest vigil of their lives. Outside dusk was falling, and with it came the killing cold of a mountain night. Cutler and his remaining able man would have to choose press the attack in darkness and cold or fall back and try again in daylight. Either way, Thade and Sarah would be ready. The night passed in tense silence, broken only by the occasional sound of voices from outside Cutler and his man arguing about tactics, about whether to wait or advance, about the bodies they'd have to explain if this all went wrong. At some point, exhaustion claimed Sarah, and she dozed against Thade's shoulder while he kept watch. He studied her face in the torchlight, memorized the curve of her cheek, the way her lashes cast shadows, the determined set of her jaw even in sleep. She'd shot a man today, wounded him badly, to protect Thade, to protect herself, to protect the fragile future they were trying to build. She'd crossed a line she could never uncross, and she'd done it without hesitation. That kind of courage deserved better than dying in a cave. As dawn light began to filter through the entrance painting, the snow outside in shades of rose and gold, Thade made his decision. He couldn't beat Cutler in a siege. The bounty hunter had supplies back at his camp, had the bodies of his men to recover, had every reason to be patient, while Thade and Sarah slowly ran out of food and water. But he could beat him in terrain. Thade knew these mountains in ways Cutler never would, knew the hidden trails, the deadly deadfalls, the places where snow hung ready to avalanche at the slightest disturbance, knew specifically about Hellmouth Canyon. It was a narrow gorge 2 miles east where the mountain face had split centuries ago, creating a vertical passage with towering walls in both sides. The snow there accumulated all winter, building up into massive cornices that hung like frozen waves above the canyon floor. Cornices that would come down with enough provocation. It was a desperate plan, probably a suicidal one, but it was better than waiting to starve or surrender. "Sarah," he said softly, touching her shoulder, "wake up. I need to tell you something." She came awake immediately, years of survival instinct kicking in. "What is it? Are they coming?" "Not yet, but they will eventually, and when they do, I'm not going to be here." He explained his plan, how he would slip out through a secondary exit to the cave, a narrow crack in the back wall, barely wide enough for his body, that he'd discovered years ago. How he would circle around behind Cutler's position, force the bounty hunter to pursue him toward Hellmouth Canyon. How the avalanche, if he could trigger it, would end this once and for all. "And if you can't trigger it," Sarah asked, her voice tight with fear, "if something goes wrong, then you wait here like we planned. 3 days, then you run for the Crow camp. But I don't plan on anything going wrong." "Thade, this is insane. Let me come with you." "No." The word was absolute. "You're the one they want. If we're both out there, Cutler wins either way. But if you're safe here, he has to divide his attention. Has to decide whether to secure you or chase me. That indecision is the edge I need." "I don't want to lose you," Sarah said, and there were tears in her voice now. "Not after everything, not when we're so close to having a future." Thade pulled her close, kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "You won't lose me. I'm too stubborn to die, and I've got too much to live for now, but I need you to trust me. Can you do that?" She was silent for a long moment, then nodded against his chest. "I trust you. Just promise me you'll come back." "I promise," he said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. He gathered supplies quickly, ammunition, rope, the small charges of blasting powder he'd acquired years ago for clearing rockfalls. Not much, but it might be enough. At the crack in the cave wall, he turned back one last time. "I love you, Serafina Marlowe. When this is over, when it's safe, I'm going to ask you properly, the way it should be done, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret saying yes." "I already said yes," Sarah whispered. "Now go prove you're good enough to deserve it." He grinned, actually grinned, and then he was gone, squeezing through the crack into the pre-dawn darkness. Sarah waited rifle ready, watching the narrow entrance, praying to a God she wasn't sure she still believed in. Outside, Thaddeus Crow began his final hunt, and on the mountain the snow waited pregnant with potential ready to fall. Thade moved through the forest like a ghost, using every trick he'd learned in 12 years of marshaling and 7 years of mountain living. He circled wide around Cutler's position, staying downwind, placing his feet with careful precision to avoid breaking branches or creating sounds that would carry in the still morning air. He could see them now, Cutler and his remaining man huddled near a fire they'd built in defiance of tactical sense. Cold had made them careless, or perhaps they thought the fight was already won. They were wrong. Thade positioned himself on a small ridge above their camp, made sure he was silhouetted against the rising sun, and fired a single shot into the air. Both men scrambled for weapons, eyes scanning the ridge. "Cutler!" Thade shouted. "You want me? Come and get me!" Then he ran. He heard Cutler's furious cursing, heard the scramble as they broke camp and gave chase. Good. The plan was working. He led them east toward Hellmouth Canyon, moving just fast enough to stay ahead, but not so fast that they'd lose his trail. He wanted them confident, wanted them thinking they were hunting rather than being hunted. The canyon entrance loomed ahead, a narrow slash in the mountainside that looked like the earth had been cleft by a giant's axe. Thade paused at the threshold, made sure Cutler saw him, then plunged into the passage. The walls rose on either side, sheer rock faces that climbed 200 feet. Above, massive cornices of snow overhung the chasm. Tons of accumulated powder held in place by nothing more than cold and prayer. Thade ran deeper into the canyon, his breath coming in ragged gasps now, the altitude and exertion taking their toll. He could hear Cutler and his man entering behind him, their footsteps echoing off the stone walls. Halfway through the canyon, Thade stopped. This was the spot where the walls narrowed and the cornices hung heaviest. He pulled out the blasting powder, set the charges against the canyon wall with hands that shook only slightly, and struck the fuse. Then he ran like hell back the way he'd come. "He's running!" Cutler's man shouted. "We've got him!" They charged forward into the narrowest part of the canyon, and Thade saw his chance. He fired his rifle at the cornice above them, the bullet striking the snow with a sharp crack. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the world came down. The explosion from the blasting powder triggered first a sharp concussive boom that shook the canyon walls. But it was the avalanche that followed that was truly terrible. Thousands of tons of snow breaking free all at once, cascading down the canyon walls like a frozen tsunami. Thade threw himself against the canyon wall, pressing into a shallow overhang as the avalanche roared past. The sound was deafening, apocalyptic, the mountain itself screaming in fury. Then silence. Absolute, ringing silence. Thade emerged from the overhang on shaking legs. Where Cutler and his man had been standing there was now only snow, a wall of white 30 feet deep, packed solid by the force of the fall. Nothing moved. No sounds came from beneath. It was over. Thade stood there for a long moment, staring at the snow that had become Vance Cutler's tomb, and felt his stomach rebel. He turned, stumbled to the canyon wall, and vomited, his body shaking with delayed shock and the weight of what he'd just done. He'd killed them, buried them alive under tons of snow and rock. It had been necessary, had been self-defense, had been the only way to end this without losing Sarah. But knowing that didn't make it easier. He wiped his mouth, straightened, and started the long walk back to the cave. Sarah was waiting. When Thade emerged from the forest an hour later, Sarah was standing outside the cave entrance, rifle in hand, her face pale with fear and relief, warring for dominance. "I heard the explosion," she said. "I thought, it's done." Thade said simply, "Cutler's gone. They're all gone." She dropped the rifle and ran to him, threw her arms around him with such force that he staggered. He held her tight, buried his face in her hair, and let himself shake. "Are you hurt?" she asked, pulling back to examine him. "No, just—" He couldn't find the words for what he was. just alive. They stood together in the snow, two people who'd survived the unsurvivable, and slowly the reality of it settled over them. It was over. They were safe. They were free. "What happens now?" Sarah asked softly. Thade looked at the cabin, at the mountain that had been his fortress and his prison, and then at the woman in his arms who'd somehow made him want to live again. "Now," he said, "we wait for Isaac to come back. We tell him what happened, the truth, or close enough to it. Self-defense against men who came to burn us out. Then we file a report with the territorial marshal, and we let the law sort through whatever mess Augustus Thornhill made. And if they don't believe us, they will. Because Isaac will back our story, and because when the marshal's office investigates, they'll find that Cutler's warrant was fabricated, and that Augustus Thornhill's been embezzling from his own father's company to finance his vendetta." Sarah's eyes widened. "How do you know that?" "Because I know men like Thornhill. And I know that kind of desperation, the kind that makes a man forge federal warrants and hire bounty hunters. It doesn't come from strength. It comes from fear of exposure. When the real investigators start digging, they'll find the rot." He was right. 3 weeks later, when the territorial marshal arrived with a full investigative team, the truth came out in pieces. Augustus Thornhill had been systematically embezzling from the northeastern Pacific for years, using Sarah's dowry to hide the shortfall. When she'd fled, his scheme had unraveled. The warrant had been fabricated to force her return before auditors discovered what he'd done. By the time spring came, Augustus Thornhill was in federal custody, facing charges of fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. His father, to save the family business, had cooperated fully with prosecutors, and Sarah was free. The cabin looked different now, larger. Thade had spent the summer and fall adding onto it a proper bedroom, a kitchen with a real stove, a small room that would be perfect for a nursery. Snow fell softly outside, the first real storm of the season, but inside the fire burned warm and bright. Sarah sat in the rocking chair Thade had made with his own hands, cradling the small bundle in her arms. The baby, a boy born just that morning, with his father's dark hair and his mother's eyes, slept peacefully against her chest. "What do you think?" she asked softly, as Thade knelt beside the chair. "Owen Nathaniel Morrison. Do you think they'd approve?" Thade looked at his son, at his wife, at the life they'd built from the ashes of loss and fear, and felt something break open in his chest. Not grief this time, but joy. "I think," he said, his voice thick, "that they'd be happy I found my way back to living." He reached out, touched his son's tiny hand, felt the infant's fingers close around his thumb with surprising strength. "You know," Sarah said, smiling despite her exhaustion, "I got a letter from Grace last week. She's coming to visit in the spring. Says she wants to meet her nephew and see the wild country that stole her sister. She's welcome any time. She also said Augustus's trial concluded, 20 years in federal prison." Thade nodded. Justice delayed, but not denied. They sat together in comfortable silence, the three of them, while outside the mountain settled into winter's grip, and inside the fire crackled with warmth and life. Later that evening, after Sarah and the baby had both fallen asleep, Thade walked out to the hillside behind the cabin, where 3 graves stood under the oak tree. The snow had covered them, but he knew where each one was by heart. "I want you to meet someone," he said softly, kneeling in the snow. "Her name is Serafina, and she's given me back the parts of myself I thought I'd buried with you. And we have a son, Owen Nathaniel, named for the boys because they'll always be part of our family, part of our story." The wind whispered through the trees, and Thade chose to believe it was approval. "I'll always love you," he said. "All of you. But I'm learning that the heart doesn't replace love, it makes room, and I think you'd want that for me. Want me to be happy again." He stood, brushed snow from his knees, and looked back at the cabin where warm light spilled from the windows into the darkness, where his wife and son waited, where his future lived and breathed. "Thank you," he said to the graves, to the memory of the family he'd lost, for teaching me how to love. I'll make sure he knows about you, about how his brothers came first, about how you made me the man who could be his father." Then Thaddeus Crow turned his back on the past and walked toward the future, toward the cabin where Sarah would wake soon and need him, where his son would cry and need feeding, where life in all its beautiful, terrifying complexity waited. The mountain would always be there, silent and enduring, but Thade no longer needed it as a fortress. He had found his home in people, not isolation. And that, he thought as he opened the cabin door and stepped into warmth and light, was the truest kind of survival there was.